In the shadowed annals of British royalty, few departures from the mortal coil have been as agonizing, as pitiable, or as thoroughly bereft of regal dignity as that of King George IV. Upon his last exhalation on June 26, 1830, the man once heralded as the first gentleman of England had devolved into a grotesque parody of kingship, a corpulent, decaying spectacle that repulsed even his most devoted attendants. This is not a tale of a monarch's dignified passing, but of a living cadaver isolated from his populace and scorned by the very pages of history. The metamorphosis from a dashing prince to a sovereign of widespread disdain unfolded over decades. Yet the precipitous descent into physical and moral degeneracy accelerated with brutal speed in his twilight years. Prepare to witness not merely the demise of a king, but the utter disintegration of a human soul. A stark, cautionary narrative of absolute authority poisoned by boundless self-indulgence, recounted through the vivid memories of those who navigated the harrowing reality of George's final days. Born on August 12, 1762, George Augustus Frederick, the eldest progeny of King George III and Queen Charlotte, was lavished with every conceivable privilege. In his youth, he embodied the epitome of royal grace, possessing keen intellect, irresistible charm, and remarkable physical appeal, rendering him the darling of fashionable society. However, even in his formative years as a prince, the insidious seeds of his future undoing were insidiously taking root. His father, the austere and devout George III, presided over a rigorously moralistic court, stifling the young prince with an atmosphere of unwavering rectitude. Consequently, by his 21st year, George had firmly established himself at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall, thereby commencing a relentless pursuit of self-gratification. The dichotomy between father and son could scarcely have been more profound. While George III championed frugality and moral rigor, his heir indulged in boundless excess. The prince surrounded himself with profligate companions, consumed copious amounts of alcohol, and engaged in scandalous affairs that titillated the ever-watchful satirical press. The 1780s ushered in George's transmutation from an attractive young prince into a figure of burgeoning darkness. His insatiable appetite for opulent cuisine became legendary. A typical breakfast might include 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, a generous portion of white wine, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a final flourish of brandy. And this was merely the prelude to his daily intake, which continued unabated with lavish luncheons and dinners, more akin to ancient Roman orgies than refined meals. As his girth expanded exponentially, so too did his debts. By the 1790s, George's liabilities to London's elite merchants and moneylenders reached astronomical proportions. Parliament repeatedly intervened with financial bailouts, but each rescue served only to fuel further extravagance. The prince appeared constitutionally incapable of exercising restraint, viewing money as an inexhaustible resource existing solely for his personal gratification. His expenditures on clothing, furniture, art, and entertainment reached levels that astounded even the most indulgent members of the aristocracy. The prince's romantic entanglements proved equally destructive. His clandestine marriage to the Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert in 1785 precipitated a constitutional crisis, while his subsequent official union with Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 evolved into one of the most calamitous royal pairings in British history. George was so repulsed by his bride upon their initial encounter that he immediately called for brandy, while Caroline remarked that he was very fat and not as handsome as his portrait. Their wedding night, marked by George's discovery unconscious and inebriated in the fireplace, foreshadowed a relationship destined to scandalize Europe. The couple's mutual antipathy became a source of public fascination, with newspapers and satirical cartoonists meticulously documenting every sordid detail of their fractured union. George's treatment of Caroline, whom he later attempted to divorce upon ascending the throne, revealed a malevolence that transcended mere marital discord. He systematically ostracized her from court, excised her name from the Book of Common Prayer, and even endeavored to prevent her attendance at his coronation. When Caroline died unexpectedly in 1821, many suspected that the relentless stress of her husband's persecution had hastened her demise, casting a dark shadow over the monarchy. Throughout these decades of scandalous behavior and excessive indulgence, George's physical form began to reflect the ravages of his lifestyle. By 1797, at the age of 35, he already weighed 245 pounds, a prodigious size for the era. His face, once celebrated as among the most handsome in England, began to bloat and distort. He developed a profusion of chins that no amount of artfully tied cravats could conceal, while his athletic physique vanished beneath layers of fat, rendering even simple movements increasingly laborious. Yet, despite his deteriorating physique, the prince's vanity remained remarkably intact. He employed a veritable army of tailors, corset makers, and cosmetic artists to maintain the illusion of his former splendor. His corsets became engineering marvels, a bastille of whalebone, as one observer quipped, meticulously designed to compress his immense belly into a semblance of human form. He donned elaborate wigs to conceal his thinning hair, applied copious amounts of rouge and powder to mask his increasingly sallow complexion, and adorned himself in ever more flamboyant attire, serving as a desperate distraction from his physical decline. When George III succumbed to his final mental collapse in 1810, his eldest son officially assumed the role of Prince Regent, wielding royal authority while his father languished in madness and seclusion. The regency period, lasting until George III's death in 1820, should have represented the zenith of the prince's achievements. Instead, it marked an acceleration of his personal decline and the transition from a merely dissolute prince to a figure of profound depravity and pathos. As Prince Regent, George wielded unparalleled power to reshape British society according to his whims. He commissioned magnificent architectural projects, extended patronage to the arts on a scale unseen since the Renaissance, and presided over some of the most dazzling social seasons in London's history. Yet, beneath the veneer of cultural achievement, a growing darkness festered, destined to consume him entirely. His alcohol consumption escalated to levels that scandalized even his hard-drinking contemporaries, while his burgeoning addiction to laudanum, a potent liquid opium preparation, began to envelop his mind in a perpetual fog. The regent's fabled banquets devolved into grotesque spectacles of unbridled consumption, shocking foreign dignitaries. During one 6-week period in 1816, Carlton House received over 5,000 pounds of meat, excluding sausages, pork, and poultry. The prince personally devoured quantities of food that defied human capacity, washing it down with rivers of wine, champagne, and spirits, leaving him in a state of stupefaction for hours on end. His dinner parties stretched from early afternoon until dawn, with guests often departing in horrified disgust at the prince's increasingly erratic behavior. By 1820, when George finally ascended to the throne as George IV, he had already become a figure of ridicule, his legitimacy undermined by years of scandal and self-destruction. His coronation, costing nearly £1 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, was widely denounced as an exercise in megalomaniacal excess. The new king appeared adorned in a crown encrusted with over 12,000 hired diamonds, his massive frame squeezed into silver tissue robes that evoked, in the words of one observer, a magnificent whale dressed for a masquerade ball. The initial years of George's reign were punctuated by political crises that exposed his fundamental unsuitability for kingship. His attempt to divorce Queen Caroline ignited a public furor, irrevocably turning the British populace against him, while his meddling in government policy betrayed a profound naive and a dangerous disregard for statecraft. Parliament learned to circumvent the king, effectively reducing him to a ceremonial figurehead whose primary function was to avoid further scandal. As the 1820s advanced, George's physical condition deteriorated with alarming speed. His weight ballooned past 280 pounds, solidifying his status as one of the most obese individuals in Britain. His legs, swollen with fluid retention, became so excruciatingly painful that he could barely ambulate. Staircases became insurmountable obstacles, compelling his servants to transport him through his own palaces like a massive, sentient piece of furniture. The dissonance between his public image as king and his private reality as an invalid drove him further into isolation and dependence. The king's laudanum addiction intensified to perilous levels during this period. He routinely ingested over 100 drops prior to public appearances, a dose sufficient to render most individuals comatose. The drug enveloped him in a perpetual haze, rendering him incapable of focusing on governmental matters for more than fleeting moments. His speeches degenerated into rambling, incoherent affairs, embarrassing his ministers and delighting his adversaries. Foreign diplomats reported that the King of England appeared either intoxicated or heavily drugged during most official functions, casting a pall over the nation's reputation on the world stage. George's eyesight deteriorated catastrophically in the late 1820s, adding another layer of mortification to his already pitiable existence. Following in the footsteps of his father, he developed severe cataracts that rendered him nearly blind. He underwent rudimentary eye surgery in September 1829, but the procedure provided minimal relief. By December 1828, he was no longer able to execute his signature on official documents, compelling Parliament to commission a stamp bearing his likeness to be affixed in his presence. The king, once renowned for his elegant penmanship, could no longer even inscribe his own name. Gout, the traditional ailment of the affluent, afflicted George with unparalleled ferocity in his final years. His hands and feet swelled to grotesque proportions, inflicting such intense pain that the slightest touch could trigger paroxysms of agony. He was forced to wear specially designed slippers to accommodate his grotesquely enlarged feet, while his hands became so distorted that he could no longer manipulate a pen or even a fork. The king, once celebrated for his refined mannerisms, was reduced to being fed like an infant by his increasingly repulsed servants. The physical transformation of George's countenance during his waning years was so profound that it shocked even those in his intimate circle. Sir David Wilkie, commissioned to paint the king's portrait in 1829, reported that George was wasting away frightfully day by day, despite his immense bulk. The artist described the experience as a most difficult and melancholy business, likening the king to a great sausage stuffed into the covering. Wilkie's portrait, diplomatically flattering as royal portraits invariably were, could not entirely conceal the fact that its subject had ceased to resemble a human being in any recognizable sense. George's breathing became increasingly labored as his massive weight constricted his lungs and heart. He could no longer recline horizontally in bed as the pressure on his chest threatened to suffocate him. Instead, he was confined to sleeping upright in a custom-built chair, his head resting on his hand, his body supported by an intricate arrangement of pillows and cushions. Even this precarious position offered scant respite, as his sleep was continually disrupted by fits of coughing and gasping, leaving him exhausted and desperately craving more laudanum. The king's skin, once admired for its delicate complexion, became a source of horror. Layers of fat had stretched it to the breaking point, creating folds and creases that were impossible to cleanse, leading to persistent infections and sores that resisted all attempts at healing. His face, bloated beyond recognition, acquired a grayish pallor, indicative of internal decay. Servants confided that touching the king's flesh felt like pressing into raw dough, soft, yielding, and somehow unwholesome, eliciting revulsion even from the most seasoned palace staff. The odor emanating from George's body became a defining characteristic of his final years. Despite the best efforts of his valet and physicians, his immense form defied proper hygiene. The combination of infected sores, unwashed flesh folds, and the noxious side effects of his myriad medications produced an overwhelming stench that caused servants to gag upon entering his chambers. Visitors to Windsor Castle reported detecting the king's presence from rooms away, guided by an aroma suggestive of advanced decomposition. George's eating habits, already legendary for their excess, became even more alarming in his final years. Incapable of properly tasting food, due to the numbing effects of his medications, he compensated by demanding ever more elaborate and heavily spiced dishes. His appetite remained prodigious despite his deteriorating health, and he would consume multiple courses even when visibly distressed. The sight of the dying king frantically shoveling food into his mouth while gasping for breath became one of the most pitiable spectacles witnessed by the Windsor Castle staff. The psychological ramifications of George's physical decline were perhaps even more devastating than the physiological changes themselves. A man who had devoted his entire life to cultivating his appearance was forced to confront his transformation into a grotesque caricature of his former self. Mirrors were systematically removed from his private quarters at his behest, as he could no longer bear to witness his reflection. The prince, once meticulous in his toilette rituals, now shunned any self-reflection. His paranoia and depression intensified as his condition worsened. George became convinced that his servants were mocking him behind his back, a suspicion that, in many instances, proved accurate. He would erupt in uncontrollable rages at the slightest perceived slight, only to collapse into fits of inconsolable weeping that could persist for hours. His emotional instability, exacerbated by his drug dependency, rendered him increasingly ungovernable, causing even his most loyal retainers to dread their assigned duties. The king's isolation from the outside world became virtually absolute as his health failed. He rarely ventured beyond his private apartments, and when he did, it was exclusively in a specially designed wheelchair capable of supporting his immense weight. The man who had once reigned as the epicenter of London's social universe now existed as a virtual prisoner within his own palace, severed from normal human interaction by his physical limitations and his profound shame. George's relationship with his medical attendants deteriorated into animosity as his condition worsened. Sir Henry Halford, the royal physician, was regularly subjected to the king's verbal assaults, while other physicians were summarily dismissed for offering candid assessments of their patients' health. George demanded medical professionals who would affirm his desired reality, that recovery was attainable, that his weight could be reduced, that his eyesight might be restored. When confronted with the stark truth of his hopeless condition, he preferred to punish the messenger rather than confront reality. The political implications of George's declining health caused increasing anxiety within the government. A king physically incapacitated, addicted to drugs, and displaying escalating signs of mental instability posed a grave threat to the stability of the monarchy. Ministers initiated contingency planning for managing a sovereign potentially rendered entirely incapacitated while technically alive, thus engendering a constitutional crisis unprecedented in its complexity. Public awareness of the king's dire condition gradually disseminated, despite the palace's efforts to maintain secrecy. Satirical cartoonists, who had lampooned George's obesity for decades, now depicted him as a literally dying monarch whose continued existence was an embarrassment to the nation. The discrepancy between official bulletins regarding the king's health, which spoke of minor indispositions and temporary setbacks, and the stark reality of his condition became a source of sardonic humor among the British populace. The servants at Windsor Castle exhibited an alarming erosion of respect for their royal master as his condition worsened. Footmen openly grumbled about the arduous task of transporting the king's immense weight, while chambermaids gossiped about the horrific stench permeating his apartments. The elaborate protocols of royal service began to unravel as staff members struggled to maintain their dignity while attending to a sovereign who had patently relinquished his own. George's sleep patterns devolved into chaos as his physical discomfort intensified. He would doze fitfully during the day, then remain awake for extended periods throughout the night, demanding the presence of servants as he battled pain and respiratory difficulties. His nocturnal tirades, frequently induced by laudanum, became legendary among the palace staff, who resorted to drawing lots to determine who would endure the king's company during his midnight vigils. The king's appetite for alcohol remained undiminished despite his obvious decline. He continued to imbibe copious quantities of wine, champagne, and spirits, frequently combining them with laudanum in concoctions that would have proven fatal to a lesser constitution. His tolerance for alcohol had become so elevated that amounts which would render ordinary individuals comatose merely made him slightly more loquacious, although his speech remained slurred and largely unintelligible. By 1829, George's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer perform even the most fundamental duties of kingship. He was unable to comprehend state papers, could not affix his signature to documents, and was too disoriented to follow political discussions. The machinery of government continued to operate around him, but the king himself had devolved into little more than a breathing corpse, occasionally roused to issue unreasonable demands or incoherent pronouncements that were summarily disregarded. The logistical challenge of transporting George from one location to another within the palace became a monumental undertaking, requiring teams of servants and specialized equipment. A chair equipped with wheels was constructed for his conveyance, but even this proved inadequate for accommodating someone of his magnitude and medical complexity. The sounds of the king's transport through the palace corridors, the groaning of machinery, the strained exertions of the servants, and George's own labored breathing served as an audible testament to the monarchy's degradation. George's personal hygiene, never particularly meticulous even during his healthier periods, virtually ceased to exist as his condition spiraled downward. His servants struggled to maintain his cleanliness, but his sheer size and medical complications rendered proper washing virtually impossible. The king would sometimes go for weeks without a thorough bath, his unwashed body contributing to the already pervasive odor that marked his presence. Visitors to the palace learned to breathe exclusively through their mouths when in close proximity to the king. The disparity between George's public persona and his private reality reached its zenith during his final years. Official portraits continued to portray a dignified monarch in resplendent robes, but those who encountered the king described a creature bearing scant resemblance to these idealized depictions. The chasm between royal propaganda and lived experience became so vast as to appear surreal, as if two entirely distinct individuals were being discussed. His long-term addiction had destroyed him, rendering George's mental state unpredictable and often dangerous. He would experience fleeting periods of relative lucidity, followed by episodes of complete cognitive impairment, wherein he failed to recognize even his closest attendants. His memory became so unreliable that he would forget conversations that had transpired mere moments earlier, and then fly into uncontrollable rages when reminded of his lapses. The king's mental deterioration heightened his paranoia and suspicion of those around him. The religious awakening that George experienced during his final months added another layer of pathos to his already tragic narrative. The man who had spent decades flagrantly disregarding Christian morality suddenly became consumed with securing divine absolution for his sins. He would spend hours confessing his transgressions to increasingly unnerved clergymen, detailing a lifetime of debauchery with a specificity that appalled his listeners. His newfound piety appeared genuine, yet was undermined by his continued inability to alter his destructive behavior. George's laudanum dependency had become so profound that his physicians feared an accidental overdose during one of his confused episodes. The concentration of opium in his bloodstream was sufficient to kill several ordinary individuals. Yet, the king's tolerance was so formidable that he appeared to function with relative normalcy, or at least as normally as his condition permitted. His doctors began to dilute his medication without informing him, but George would demand progressively larger doses to achieve the desired effect. The king's relationship with food became increasingly dysfunctional as his death neared. Despite his obvious inability to properly digest meals, he persisted in demanding elaborate multi-course dinners, which he consumed with mechanical determination. The sight of George forcing down food while clearly in distress became one of the most disturbing aspects of his final period, suggesting a man who had severed all connection to his own physical needs and limitations. Genuine personal relationships became virtually unattainable for George as his condition deteriorated. His longtime mistress, the Marchioness Conyngham, gradually withdrew from the court as the king's appearance became too grotesque to bear. His few remaining friends concocted excuses to avoid visiting Windsor Castle, leaving George surrounded solely by paid servants who could scarcely conceal their revulsion at his presence. The king, once the focal point of admirers and sycophants, died essentially alone. The pervasive odor of decay emanating from George began to affect the other occupants of Windsor Castle. Queen Adelaide, the wife of George's brother William, who would later become William IV, reportedly relocated to different quarters to escape the stench. Servants began to volunteer for duties that would distance them from the king's apartments, while those who remained would wrap cloths around their faces to filter the air they breathed. George's delusions became more elaborate and detached from reality as his demise approached. He would occasionally assert that he had fought at the Battle of Waterloo, despite having spent the entire Napoleonic Wars safely ensconced in England. His fantasies of military valor provided a stark contrast to his actual condition as an immobile invalid who could barely support his own head. These episodes of grandiose ideation alternated with periods of profound melancholia, during which George would weep for hours over his wasted existence. The king's final months were marked by an escalating series of medical crises that his physicians were powerless to resolve. His heart, struggling to circulate blood through his immense frame, began to fail with increasing frequency. His breathing became so labored that even minimal exertion would leave him gasping and cyanotic. His physicians recognized that death was inevitable, but they could not predict the precise moment or manner of its arrival, leaving everyone in a state of grim anticipation. Physical suffering became George's constant companion during his final period. The combined effects of gout, dropsy, heart failure, and myriad other ailments orchestrated a symphony of agony that no amount of laudanum could completely suppress. He would cry out in anguish during the night, his screams reverberating through the palace corridors and terrifying the staff. The king's suffering was so palpable and so unrelenting that even his most vehement detractors began to experience a degree of pity for his plight. The breakdown of normal palace protocol during George's final months reflected the extraordinary nature of his condition. Servants who would normally have faced immediate dismissal for the slightest impropriety now openly discussed their master's revolting condition. The rigid hierarchy governing royal households began to crumble as staff members struggled to fulfill duties that extended far beyond the scope of their training. The monarchy itself appeared to be decaying in tandem with its sovereign. George's awareness of his impending death engendered a terror that was agonizing to witness. Despite his physical suffering, he clung desperately to life, imploring his doctors for any treatments that might extend his existence, even if only briefly. His fear of death was so intense that he refused to sleep, convinced that he would never awaken. This existential dread added a psychological dimension to his suffering, rendering his final months even more harrowing for those who observed them. The king's bowel movements became a matter of urgent medical concern as his digestive system began to fail. The enormous quantities of food he consumed could no longer be properly processed, leading to painful blockages that would persist for days. When relief finally arrived, it was often accompanied by blood and other alarming indicators of organ failure. These intimate medical details were openly discussed by the palace staff, who had long abandoned any semblance of royal decorum. Religious figures who visited the dying king reported that George's confessions had become so detailed and disturbing that they questioned the impact of hearing them on their own spiritual well-being. The king's recitation of his lifetime of sins was so comprehensive and graphic that it seemed less like contrition and more like a final indulgence in the very behaviors he professed to regret. His spiritual advisors struggled to offer solace to a man whose guilt appeared as immense as his physical size. The political establishment commenced preparations for George's demise with an eagerness that bordered on indecency. His brother William, the heir apparent, was briefed on royal protocols while George still clung to life, and government ministers made little effort to conceal their relief at the prospect of a new monarch. The disparity between the official expressions of concern for the king's health and the private preparations for his succession revealed the extent to which George had alienated those around him. George's final weeks were punctuated by a series of false alarms that kept the palace staff in a perpetual state of heightened alert. He would appear to be on the verge of death, only to rally temporarily before relapsing into a new crisis. These episodes took a psychological toll on everyone involved, creating an atmosphere of relentless tension that disrupted normal life. The king's refusal to die cleanly and quickly seemed like one final act of selfishness, inconveniencing everyone around him. The king's last days were spent in a specially designed chair that allowed him to sleep in an upright position, his head resting on his hand for support. This pathetic Imagia king, incapable of lying down in his own bed, became symbolic of how completely his physical condition had eroded his dignity. Servants would observe him struggling to breathe in this uncomfortable position, his massive frame shaking with the effort of drawing air into his failing lungs. On the night of June 25, 1830, George's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. His breathing became even more labored, and his complexion turned an alarming shade of gray, indicative of complete circulatory collapse. His physicians knew that the end was imminent, but the king himself seemed oblivious to how near death had come. He dismissed Sir Henry Halford for the evening and settled into his chair for what would be his final repose as a living being. Sir Wathin Waller, George's ophthalmologist and one of his few remaining confidants, sat vigil with the dying king throughout his final night. The scene was both poignant and pathetic. A grotesquely obese, moribund monarch holding hands with one of the few individuals who still cared enough to remain by his side. The stark contrast between George's immense failing body and this simple human gesture of companionship underscored the tragedy of a life lived devoid of genuine love or friendship. As dawn approached on June 26, 1830, George began to exhibit unmistakable signs of impending death. His breathing became erratic, and his massive frame appeared to be shutting down systematically. At approximately 3 a.m., he awoke from his fitful slumber and experienced his final crisis, a bloody bowel movement signifying the complete disintegration of his digestive system. The king's last conscious act was to summon his physician, reportedly crying out, Sir Henry, fetch him! This is death." The final moments of George IV's life were as undignified as everything that had preceded them. According to various accounts, his last words were either, "Surely this must be death," "Good God, what is this?" or simply incoherent groans as his massive body finally succumbed to the cumulative ravages of decades of abuse. He died at 3:15 a.m. On June 26, 1830, his head falling onto his page's shoulder as his tormented breathing finally ceased. The autopsy conducted after George's death revealed the full extent of the internal damage wrought by his lifestyle. His physicians discovered massive deposits of fat surrounding all his vital organs, particularly his heart and kidneys. The sheer quantity of fat had literally crushed his internal organs, rendering normal function impossible. His stomach bore evidence of the ruptured blood vessel responsible for his final crisis, while his liver exhibited the telltale signs of chronic alcoholism. The news of George IV's death disseminated rapidly throughout London, but the public response differed markedly from that accorded to previous monarchs. Instead of the customary outpouring of grief and mourning, there was barely concealed relief, and in many instances, overt celebration. The Times, the most reputable newspaper of the era, published what may be the most scathing obituary ever penned for a British king, asking pointedly, "What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow?" The paper continued its devastating assessment. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. If he ever had a friend, a devoted friend, in any rank of life, we protest that the name of him or her never reached us. This brutal honesty reflected a widespread public sentiment that George IV had been not merely a deficient king, but a fundamentally repugnant human being whose death was cause for rejoicing rather than mourning. The practical challenges of preparing George's corpse for burial presented one final indignity for the deceased monarch. His immense size rendered normal funeral preparations impossible, necessitating custom-built equipment and reinforcements to accommodate his weight. The coffin was constructed of Spanish mahogany lined with lead to contain his massive form, while the palace corridors required protective wooden panels to prevent damage from the weight of the casket and its grotesque contents. Even in death, George's body continued to emit the odor that had made his final years so unbearable for those around him. Undertakers working on the corpse complained vociferously about the stench, while the embalming process proved unusually arduous due to the king's size and the advanced state of decay that appeared to have commenced even prior to his death. The man who had once been obsessed with perfumes and cosmetics had become a source of revulsion that no amount of preparation could entirely mask. The lying in state at Windsor Castle was notable for the dearth of genuine mourning among the attendees. While protocol mandated somber attire and appropriate solemnity, observers noted that the atmosphere was more akin to morbid curiosity than sorrowful remembrance. Many arrived merely to gawk at the oversized casket rather than pay their respects, while others seemed intent on confirming George's demise rather than lamenting his passing. The funeral procession itself devolved into a subject of derision rather than reverence. Contemporary accounts describe courtiers exchanging banal jokes during the ceremony, while the overall atmosphere suggested relief rather than bereavement. Even George's brother William, now William IV, reportedly exhibited inappropriate enthusiasm regarding his new role as king, conducting himself with a lack of decorum that shocked even those accustomed to royal dysfunction. The funeral service within St. George's Chapel was marred by considerable noise and disruptions unrelated to genuine emotion. The sounds emanated not from weeping mourners, but from restless attendees, eager for the proceedings to conclude so that they could return to their customary routines. The stark contrast with the sincere grief that had characterized other royal funerals was readily apparent and widely remarked upon by those in attendance. The burial itself necessitated specialized engineering to manage George's gargantuan coffin. The floor of the royal vault required reinforcement to support the weight, while additional pulleys and supports were installed to lower the casket safely. Even this final mechanical process seemed to symbolize how George's physical excesses had complicated every facet of his existence, rendering even death more arduous and costly than necessary. The immediate aftermath of George's death revealed the extent to which he had alienated those who had known him. No genuinely heartfelt tributes emerged from friends or loved ones. No tender recollections of private kindnesses or concealed virtues. Instead, the predominant response was a sense of liberation that a national embarrassment had finally ended, freeing Britain from the ignominy of being represented by such a grotesque and dysfunctional monarch. The Duke of Wellington, perhaps the most esteemed figure in Britain at the time, offered a characteristically blunt assessment of the deceased king. He was the worst man he ever fell in with, his whole life, the most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality. This judgment from a man who had known George personally for decades carried significant weight and reflected the sentiments of many who had interacted with the king professionally. The transition to William IV was marked by a palpable sense of relief throughout the government and court. While William possessed his own eccentricities and shortcomings, he represented a marked improvement over his predecessor by virtue of being a functional human being. The contrast between the two brothers, one a grotesque invalid, the other at least capable of performing basic royal duties, underscored the magnitude of George's failure in every aspect of his reign. Historical analyses of George IV's reign have been uniformly negative, with historians struggling to identify any enduring positive legacy from his decade as king. His architectural patronage and cultural contributions, while substantial, have been overshadowed by his personal failings and the damage he inflicted upon the institution of monarchy. Most scholars conclude that Britain would have been better served had George never been born, let alone ascended the throne. The medical implications of George's death were largely ignored by contemporary observers, who focused primarily on the moral and political dimensions of his failure, rather than on comprehending the physiological mechanisms that had led to his demise. His death from obesity-related complications was uncommon for the period and might have provided valuable insights into the health risks associated with extreme overeating and alcoholism, but these opportunities for medical advancement were lost. The satirical press reveled in George's death and funeral, producing cartoons and commentary that lampooned everything from his oversized coffin to the absence of genuine mourners. The artistic tradition of royal satire reached new heights of ferocity in response to George's death, with artists feeling emboldened to express opinions about the monarchy that had been suppressed during the king's lifetime. The cost of George's funeral and burial added a final indignity to a reign characterized by financial excess. The elaborate ceremonies, specialized equipment, and reinforcements required to manage his massive body cost the treasury thousands of pounds at a time when the country was grappling with substantial debt. Even in death, George managed to be more expensive and troublesome than any ordinary citizen could have been. So, as we've explored, the story of King George IV's final days is a truly haunting one. It's a somber reminder that even those born into immense privilege and power can be consumed by their own excesses, leading to a life marked by isolation, physical decay, and ultimately, a legacy of profound regret. It really serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unchecked indulgence and the importance of living a life of balance and genuine connection. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What struck you most about George IV's story? Do you see any parallels to our own modern struggles with excess and self-control? Feel free to share your insights, ask any questions you have, or just join the discussion in the comments below. And if you found this exploration of history's darker corners compelling, Please consider subscribing to the channel. We'll continue to delve into fascinating, sometimes unsettling narratives from the past, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. Thanks for watching.